This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Okay, so when you think about Japanese Canadians, right?
Yeah.
World War II probably comes to mind, right? Pearl Harbor, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
But have you ever thought about what happened on the Canadian side of the Pacific, like after Pearl Harbor?
It's a really interesting story.
Yeah.
A story that needs to be told.
Yeah, it's a story that often gets kind of buried.
Absolutely.
And that's kind of what we're doing today. We're unearthing it. We're doing a deep dive into this complex event. And we're using this episode of the Mr. Hutchings History podcast as our guide.
A fantastic resource.
Yeah, you can think of us as like your shortcut
Mm-hmm.
to understanding this period in history.
I like that.
Not just the facts,
Right.
but how historians kind of interpret.
The different interpretations.
Yeah, different interpretations of this kind of dark period.
Right, because there's always more than one side to the story.
Exactly. So before we even get to the war years, right, imagine Canada in the early 1900s.
Yeah.
There's already this like thriving Japanese Canadian community in British Columbia.
Right.
And you have the Usei, who are like the first generation that immigrated there.
Right.
And then their Canadian-born children, the Nisei.
This is an important distinction to make because it really dismantles this common misconception that's out there.
Yeah.
That these were newcomers.
Right.
No, these are families.
Yeah.
These are people who had built lives.
Mm-hmm.
They had businesses, communities.
Yeah.
They were Canadians.
They were Canadians, and then boom, December 1941, Pearl Harbor.
Right.
And all of a sudden, fear and suspicion are just everywhere.
Mm.
And what happens next is really chilling.
Yeah.
The Canadian Pacific Railway, which was like a huge employer at the time,
Yeah.
fires all their Japanese Canadian workers.
Wow.
Just like that.
Just like that.
Can you imagine the ripple effect if that happened today?
It would be devastating.
Right.
Absolutely devastating.
Like just poof, gone.
Yeah. And I think it speaks volumes about how quickly prejudice can turn into action.
Yeah.
Especially in times of crisis.
Especially in times of crisis. And it doesn't stop there.
No.
The government's like fueled by this public anxiety, right?
Yeah.
And politicians like Ian McKenzie who said this crazy thing.
I know what you're going to say.
No Japs from the Rockies to the seas.
Wow.
Like just,
Yeah, that quote is really shocking.
it's a shocking quote.
But it really does sum up
Yeah.
the feelings in British Columbia at the time.
Yeah.
It's like this glimpse into how deep that fear ran.
Right.
And how politicians were able to use that.
Yeah, they were totally playing on that.
Absolutely.
So within months, in 1942, the unthinkable happens.
Yeah.
Over 21,000 Japanese Canadians,
Wow.
men, women, children,
Jeez.
are forcibly removed from their homes.
It's unbelievable.
One suitcase, that's all they're allowed to take.
Oh, my God.
They're processed through these like makeshift centers. Some of them were literally livestock barns.
I've heard that, too, yeah.
And then they're sent to these internment camps that are scattered across the country.
Yeah, it's a scene that we've seen play out
I know.
so many times.
So many times in history.
Like, it echoes what we see with refugees.
Absolutely.
And today.
Yeah, it's scary how much history repeats itself.
It is.
And there's this one detail from the podcast that always gets me.
Okay.
This guy, Yukiharu Misuyabu,
Mm-hmm.
he was so furious
Yeah.
that he had to pay for his own imprisonment.
Are you serious?
Like, the government made him cover the costs of his own detention. Wow! Like, that's crazy.
It's adding insult to injury.
Yeah.
If it was such a security threat,
Right.
why are you making them pay for it?
Exactly. It just makes you question their motive.
Yeah, for sure.
So, like, why did this happen?
Yeah.
Historians have come up with a bunch of different explanations.
It's rarely a simple answer when it comes to history.
Never is.
Is it?
The most obvious one is national security, right? Yeah. That there was this fear of espionage, sabotage, a fifth column operating in Canada,
Right.
which on the surface seems logical.
Seems logical, but
Yeah.
not a single Japanese Canadian was ever charged with espionage
Wow.
or any act of treason against Canada during the war.
So, like, how real was the threat? That's the question.
Exactly.
Which brings us to, like, the racial prejudice argument.
Yeah.
Historians who believe this point to this long history of anti-Asian sentiment in Canada.
Right.
We saw it with the Canadian Pacific Railway firings. But it goes way back.
Way back. And even within this view, there's a lot of debate about what kind of prejudice it was.
Oh, yeah.
Was it about getting Japanese Canadians out of British Columbia specifically? Or was it part of a larger anti-Asian sentiment across the country?
Interesting.
Yeah.
And then there's the economic interest angle.
Right.
Remember, Japanese Canadians were successful.
Yeah.
In industries like fishing and agriculture, they own land.
Yeah.
Businesses. So was this just an opportunity for others to kind of like take advantage of the situation?
You know, after the internment fishing boats owned by Japanese Canadians were sold off for hardly anything.
Wow.
Imagine that.
Jeez.
You're a fisherman.
Yeah.
You lose your livelihood.
Yeah.
And someone else is profiting from it.
That's just devastating.
It is. And it connects to these modern debates about immigration and economic competition.
Yeah.
How often are these economic anxieties masked as security concerns?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
The podcast also talks about the civil libertarian perspective. This is like a warning sign about how easily our rights can be taken away.
For sure.
Even in a democracy like Canada.
It can happen anywhere.
It's a scary thought.
Absolutely.
But it resonates even now.
It does. It really does.
Doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it really does. And, you know, the war ends.
Right.
But for Japanese Canadians, it's not over.
No?
They go back home.
Yeah.
And everything's gone.
Oh, yeah. Their homes, their businesses, like everything's just been ripped away.
It's just shattered. It wasn't just a wartime thing.
Right.
It had these lasting effects.
Yeah, and it's heartbreaking. And then the fight for justice, that took decades. And it was really led by the Nisei.
Right.
That second generation. Who grew up hearing these stories.
Hearing these stories of loss and displacement.
Yeah. Their story, the Redress Movement, it's so powerful.
Inspiring.
It wasn't just about like righting a historical wrong. It was about reclaiming their place in Canadian society.
Exactly.
The podcast mentions this guy, Roy Miquette.
Okay.
He was a young boy when his family was interned.
Wow.
And years later, he became like a key figure in this whole redress movement.
Totally.
And he talks about how there was this silence for years surrounding the internment.
Right. Like people didn't talk about it.
No.
It was almost like a source of shame.
Right. And it's interesting how
it's a common response to trauma.
Yeah.
But that silence just lets these things fester.
It does.
Doesn't it?
So the redress movement, they like broke that silence.
Yeah.
They protested.
They demanded recognition.
Yeah, they demanded accountability from the government.
It's amazing.
It's incredible. Like, can you imagine the courage that took?
I know, to speak out against the people who wronged you.
Yeah, and their efforts finally paid off.
They did.
In 1988, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney issues this formal apology to Japanese Canadians.
That's huge.
He acknowledges the injustice, the pain, the loss.
And survivors received $21,000 each.
Yeah, it was a huge moment.
It wasn't just about the money.
Right.
But that was important.
Yeah.
It was about admitting that they were wrong.
Yeah. But, you know, the question still remains.
Yeah.
Can any amount of money truly compensate for losing your home?
Your business, your community.
Yeah, like the scars.
The psychological scars.
Yeah.
It's a question that goes beyond this one event.
It does.
You know, makes us think about apologies and reparations.
Yeah.
When it comes to these historical injustices.
Right. And the podcast also mentions that even today, a lot of Japanese Canadians still struggle with this trauma.
Trauma is intergenerational.
It is.
It gets passed down in ways we don't even realize.
Yeah. So the effects of this internment are still shaping lives.
Even for people born after the war.
Exactly. And the podcast talks about how this event has really shaped the Japanese-Canadian identity.
Yeah.
There's this sense of resilience, of community. But also this awareness of how fragile things are.
Right.
How quickly things can change.
How quickly your place in society can be taken away.
Yeah, it's a reminder that history isn't just about these dates and events.
It's about lived experiences that continue to shape us today.
Yeah, and it connects to these bigger themes of social justice and human rights.
Absolutely.
The Japanese-Canadian internment is like this warning about what can happen when we let fear and prejudice win.
It's a story that we see reflected in other movements around the world.
Yeah.
The fight for recognition.
Yeah.
For equality.
Yeah.
For basic dignity.
It's a universal struggle.
It transcends borders and time.
And this fight continues today.
It does.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
We see it in Black Lives Matter. The fight for indigenous rights.
Yeah, all these marginalized communities fighting for their rights.
Right, and it's a reminder that justice is an ongoing process.
Absolutely.
A constant struggle against oppression.
Yes, and the redress movement shows us that even when things seem impossible, we can make a difference.
We can.
It takes courage, perseverance, and a belief in collective action.
Yeah, it's inspiring, isn't it?
It really is.
It shows that change is possible, even if it takes like a really long time.
Yeah, generation.
The fight for redress wasn't just about the past. You know, it was about making a better future.
Absolutely, and it reminds us that history isn't just about facts and dates.
Yeah.
It's about people.
Yeah.
And the choices they made and,
the consequences.
The ripple effects that are still felt today.
And speaking of complexities, there's one thing the podcast didn't really talk about.
Okay.
And it really got me thinking.
What's that?
We've talked about security concerns.
Yeah.
Racial prejudice. Economic interests.
Right.
But what about gender?
Oh, that's interesting.
Like, how did gender play into all of this?
It's a great question. And it's one that often gets overlooked.
I know.
We know that women experience things differently than men.
Right.
So it makes sense that Japanese Canadian women would have faced unique challenges during this time.
Totally. Like the podcast mentioned family separations, the loss of homes and businesses. But what about the specific burdens that women faced? Like, think about the mothers who had to care for their kids in these, like, totally unfamiliar places.
Yeah, in these camps.
Or, like, the young women whose education was interrupted.
Right, all their dreams put on hold.
And what about, like, the cultural expectations placed on women within the Japanese-Canadian community?
Yeah, how did that all play into the trauma of being displaced?
Exactly.
And adapting to a new life?
Like, we've only just scratched the surface here.
We have. And that's where you, our listener, come in.
That's right.
We've given you a starting point.
Yeah.
Now it's your turn to go deeper.
Go explore.
Find the voices of these Japanese Canadian women.
Read their stories.
Yeah, learn about their experiences.
Imagine, like, you could sit down with a woman who lived through this.
Right.
What would you ask her?
What would you want to know?
Right. It's about going beyond the textbook.
Yeah.
And really understanding these personal stories.
Exactly. Yeah. Because that's what makes history come alive.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we're leaving you with this challenge.
A challenge.
Explore this untold side of the story.
Yeah.
Learn about these amazing women.
The women who lived through this.
Yeah, and their stories will not only help you understand the internment better, but they'll teach you about resilience, identity, and like the power of a human spirit.
The human spirit is incredible.
It really is.
Yeah.
So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.